All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a little different, something a bit more meta. We're not just looking at a specific historical event or period this time. Instead, we're going to dive into the philosophy of history.
hmm
It's kind of like, for you, the learner, instead of just reading the history book, we're going to talk about how that book was even written in the first place. What are the different lenses that historians and philosophers thinking about history use to try to make sense of the past? How do we even think about what happened before us?
Yeah, I think what's fascinating from a philosophical perspective, right, is that uh, philosophy of history
Hmm.
as a category, it's not really this nice, neat little box. It's more like we've got this huge, sprawling collection of ideas, theories, approaches, and they often come from very different intellectual traditions. So you've got, idealists, positivists, even theologians weighing in, logicians, and you've got folks coming from, all over Europe, the Anglo-American world. And what makes it even more interesting is that a lot of these different groups aren't even really directly engaging with each other. It's like they're having these separate conversations.
Yeah, it's like everyone's got their own favorite set of tools and they're busy building their own part of this
hmm
giant structure, but they don't necessarily have the same blueprints.
Yeah.
So to give you a bit of a roadmap for this deep dive, our sources point to four, I guess you could call them core questions that seem to pop up again and again when philosophers start to wrestle with history. And I think the first one is maybe the most basic, but it's also really deep.
Oh, yeah.
What is history? Like when we say the past, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about the big, blockbuster events, the wars, the revolutions? Or is it more about the everyday lives of individuals? Or is it about the, I don't know, the underlying social structures, the economic systems, the stuff that maybe isn't as flashy but kind of shapes everything else? Or maybe it's even about these broader forces, these almost invisible patterns that play out over generations.
Yeah, so for a philosopher that really gets into the ontology of history, right? What kind of thing is the past? Like, are we primarily concerned with the actions of individuals, emphasizing this human agency? Or do we really need to focus on these larger social structures, economic, political structures that maybe seem to have a life of their own, independent of the individuals within them? Like if you think about, I don't know, the Industrial Revolution, how do we explain that? Do we do it through the inventions of specific people? Or by looking at, I don't know, broader shifts in, economic systems and how societies were organized, different philosophical approaches are going to really emphasize one or the other.
Okay. And then the second question, this one gets a little bit more, maybe a little more ambitious. It's about whether history, like as a whole, the whole shebang, has some kind of overarching meaning, some kind of structure, or even a direction. Is there some grand narrative playing out? Are we as a species moving towards something specific, or are we stuck in some kind of, cycle, or is it all just, I don't know, a random sequence of events? This feels like one of those really big, why are we here kind of questions, but applied to the whole sweep of human existence.
Precisely. And philosophers, they use this fancy word for it, teleology. Is there a purpose, an inherent purpose, or a goal in history? Some thinkers have looked for this, through religious frameworks. They see history as unfolding according to a divine plan, right? But then you've got others who, maybe they're not religious, but they still have this idea of progress. They think humanity is, gradually advancing, getting better in some way, morally, technologically, whatever. Thinkers like Hegel, for example, he saw history as this unfolding, this realization of human freedom. So yeah, it's a big question. For you, the learner, what's really interesting here is that we're not just talking about random stuff happening. Some philosophers are actually suggesting there might be this inherent direction to history, which, I don't know, can be a pretty optimistic way of looking at things.
Yeah, it can. And then the third question, this one gets a bit more down to earth, a bit more practical. How do we actually do history? Like, how do we go about figuring out what happened, representing it, explaining it? What are the tools that historians use? How do they sift through the evidence, make sense of it, and I guess build their interpretations? This feels like it's really about the nature of historical knowledge itself. Like, how do we know what we know about the past?
Right, this gets into the epistemology of history. How do we know what we claim to know about what happened before us? So philosophers of history, they look at this whole process of historical inquiry. How do historians interpret sources, which, let's face it, can be biased, incomplete, even deliberately falsified? And then how do they take those sources, those fragments of information, and construct a coherent explanation, something that makes sense? And a big question here is, are there any sort of general laws, kind of like the laws of physics that govern historical events? Or is each situation kind of unique and you need a totally different way of understanding it?
Right, right. So, like, is there a historical equivalent of gravity, or are we dealing with something more like, I don't know, a kaleidoscope where every twist gives you a completely new pattern?
Exactly. And then how do historians even try to be objective,
Hmm.
right? Given all these complexities, all these different layers of interpretation, that's a huge challenge.
It is. Do the historical facts that we uncover, especially maybe the difficult ones, the ones that make us uncomfortable, do they create a sense of responsibility for us today? Like, if we know about some past injustice, does that obligate us to act in a certain way now?
Yeah, this is a really crucial ethical dimension to our relationship with the past. If we acknowledge that, something like slavery or a genocide caused immense suffering, does that recognition create a moral imperative? Does it obligate us to do something in the present? And what might that even look like? Does it mean seeking justice? Does it mean offering reparations? Or maybe it's more about just making sure that these kinds of atrocities never happen again. This really forces us to consider how much impact history have on us, on who we are, and on what we choose to do in our own time. We're not just neutral observers here. We inherit this history, and that comes with certain responsibilities.
Yeah, it's like we're all part of this ongoing story, whether we like it or not. All right. So, to give you a sense of where we're going with this deep dive, we're going to try to navigate through how historians actually do their work, what they do, what they think about, what challenges they face. We'll touch on some of the big debates that have happened both in continental and Anglo American philosophy of history. We'll look at the relationship between the actual practice of doing history, that's historiography, and the philosophy of history. And then we'll even think about some of the really unique complexities of trying to understand the very recent past, like the 20th century.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we'll be exploring is how different thinkers have conceptualized these historical actors, right? The individuals and the larger structures they operate within. And we can't avoid the fact that there's always an element of selectivity in how we study history.
Hmm.
We can't look at everything, right? We have to choose what we focus on. And then, of course, there's the whole role of memory and narrative. How do those things shape how we understand the past, both individually and collectively? It's about appreciating all these layers, all these complexities involved in trying to construct this this account of the human story. It's not simple.
It's not simple at all. Okay, so let's maybe start to get into the practical side a bit. How do historians actually do what they do? What's involved in this whole process? Our source points to, well, several key intellectual tasks. And the first one seems pretty straightforward. It's about, conceptualizing and describing what happened in the past. It's basically answering those what questions. What happened? What was it like? But even this, apparently, it's got some philosophical depth to it.
Yeah, because even when you're just trying to describe something, you're already using these underlying conceptual frameworks. And these frameworks, they're not neutral. They come preloaded with certain assumptions and interpretations.
Right.
Like take the example of, I don't know, the events in Detroit in 1967. Were those a riot or were they an uprising?
Right.
The words you choose, they matter.
Right.
For you, the learner, think about it this way. Choosing one word over the other, it reflects a certain interpretation of what happened, what the causes were, and what the motivations of the people involved were.
Yeah.
So even when you're just trying to describe something, you're already engaging in a kind of historical interpretation. It's shaped by these concepts that we bring to the table.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, of course, historians also want to know why. They want to understand the causes and the conditions that led to certain events. So that's where explanation comes in. And apparently, it's not as simple as just listing what came before something else. You need to understand the context, you need to think about the choices people made, and you need to get at these underlying mechanisms that were at play.
Right, so this takes us to this big philosophical question about historical causation. What does it even mean to say that one event caused another in history? Are we talking about these big, sweeping social forces? Or is it more about the individual decisions and motivations? Or is it some kind of, messy combination of both? And how do you even begin to weigh the relative importance of all these different factors in these incredibly complex situations? That's what philosophers of history try to untangle.
Yeah, it's like trying to figure out which thread in a tapestry is the most important one. They're all kind of woven together, right?
Exactly.
And it's not just about asking why did this happen? It's also about asking, how is this even possible? Like, how did certain outcomes that might seem really unlikely when you look back, how did they actually come about? Like, you could think about, I don't know, how did this relatively small trade union in Poland end up being one of the triggers that helped to bring down the entire Soviet bloc? It's like, wow, how did that happen? So This kind of question is about looking at the specific pathways, the twists and turns, the decisions, the maybe even the moments of chance that led to these outcomes, especially when those outcomes weren't, some kind of foregone conclusion.
Right, so this highlights the importance of what philosophers sometimes call contingency and agency. Contingency is the idea that things could have gone differently, that there wasn't just this one inevitable path. And then agency is the idea that people make choices, and those choices matter, even if they're making them within certain constraints.
Okay. And then there's this whole area of trying to get inside people's heads, right? Historians, they often want to understand the perspectives of the people they're studying. Why did a particular leader make this decision? Why did this social movement gain traction? Why did people get behind it? So this requires not just looking at actions, but trying to understand the thoughts, the motivations, the beliefs, the cultural background, all that stuff.
Yeah, so this is what's often called the hermeneutic, or the interpretive side of historical inquiry. It's about trying to understand the world from the viewpoint of those historical actors. And this involves not just, observing what they did, but really trying to grasp how they understood what they were doing, what meanings they attached to their actions, what their values were. So it's definitely a more subjective and nuanced kind of approach compared to just, identifying these cause and effect relationships.
Yeah.
It's about trying to get at the meaning behind the actions.
Okay. Yeah, it's like the why behind the what. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then underlying all of this is the very basic but actually really difficult task of just finding and making sense of historical information itself. Archives, they can be messy, right? Things are missing, stuff gets lost. Sometimes records are deliberately destroyed or altered. So historians kind of have to be like detectives, piecing together this coherent and hopefully accurate account from all these scattered fragments.
And that brings us back to this fundamental challenge of historical epistemology. How do we know what we know about the past? What even counts as reliable evidence? How do we deal with the fact that there are these huge gaps in the historical record? How do we deal with conflicting accounts from different sources? It's like putting together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and some of them might be from a different puzzle entirely.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
Okay, so our source, it kind of digs into three preliminary issues that seem to be relevant to pretty much all discussions about history. The first one is this idea of the ontology of history. And, for you, the learner, that basically means what are the real things that we're talking about when we study history? Are we talking about individuals? Are we talking about social structures? Are we talking about events, processes? Like, what are the basic building blocks of this thing we call history?
Yeah, and this might seem kind of abstract, but it's actually really important. Like, what's the nature of the historical reality we're trying to grasp? Do these large-scale social structures actually exist independently of the people within them? Or are they ultimately just the product of all those individual actions and beliefs? It's a bit like, the chicken and the egg thing. This often leads to these debates between actor-centered and structure-centered views of historical explanation.
Okay, so it's like, are we mainly shaped by the systems we live in, or are those systems just the result of all the little choices that people make?
Right, and how much power do individuals have to actually change those systems?
Right, right. Okay, and the second issue is this idea of selectivity. Historians can't study everything, right? There's just too much information, too many events, too many perspectives. So they have to make choices about what to focus on, what to leave out. They might choose to focus on certain themes, certain geographical areas, certain time periods, or certain levels of analysis. And apparently this isn't just a practical limitation. It actually shapes the kind of knowledge that we can even get about the past.
Yeah, this is a point that a lot of thinkers have made, and it gets to the role of the historian's own perspective, their own values, even if those values are unspoken. Like the sociologist Max Weber pointed out, historical reality is infinitely complex. It's this vast web of interconnected events and processes. So historians have to select, they have to choose what threads to pull on. And different historians are going to pull on different threads, right? Which means they're going to end up telling different stories, even if they're all trying to be objective and accurate. Huh. It's not that history is purely subjective, it's just a matter of opinion. But it does mean that there are multiple potentially valid ways of understanding the past. And those ways are going to be shaped by the choices that historians make.
Okay, and then the third issue, this one's about the relationship between history and stories and also collective memory. So, history is often presented in the form of a narrative, right? We tell a story about what happened, but how does that narrative relate to individual memories? And how does it relate to the shared stories that groups tell about themselves, their origin stories, their myths, their national narratives? And then how do all those narratives, those stories, how do they shape who we are in the present and even how we act?
Yeah, so this gets at the power of narrative. It's
Yeah.
not just about conveying information, right?
Okay.
We use stories to make sense of the world, to create meaning, to identify what we think are the important causes and effects. And collective memory, those shared stories that bind groups together, those can be incredibly powerful. They shape our identities. They provide us with a sense of belonging. They can even influence the course of events, like we saw with the rise of, I don't know, Serb nationalism in the lead up to the Yugoslav wars.
Okay, so we've got this multi-layered thing going on. We've got individual memories, we've got collective memory, we've got the stories that historians tell, and they're all kind of interacting with each other.
Exactly. And they all influence each other.
Okay, so let's move into some of these different philosophical traditions now. And maybe we can start with continental philosophy of history. And I gather that there's been a long tradition, particularly in Germany, of looking at history as this grand, all-encompassing process, this unfolding of something. And these thinkers, they're trying to identify these big, overarching patterns and directions in history, even though, when you look at the details, it often seems like it's just this chaotic jumble of random events.
Yeah, and this is often called speculative philosophy of history.
Yeah.
You've got thinkers like Vico, Herder, and of course, most notably Hegel, and they're all trying to discern these large-scale movements, these historical trends that run through, vast stretches of time. They're not just interested in the chronology. They're looking for meaning, for a deeper understanding of what this whole human story is really about.
Okay, so they're looking for the signal in the noise, so to speak.
Exactly.
All right. And one of the big debates within this continental tradition seems to revolve around this question of human nature. Is there some kind of universal, unchanging core to who we are, something that's been the same throughout history? Or is human nature itself shaped and changed by historical circumstances? Like, is it something fluid, something dynamic, something that evolves? This feels like a pretty fundamental question for how we interpret the actions and the motivations of people in the past.
It's absolutely fundamental. Like, if there is this consistent universal human nature, like the philosopher Vico argued, then maybe we can understand people in the past based on our own experiences, our own motivations. But if human nature is itself a product of its historical context, like Herder suggested, then we have to be way more careful about, projecting our own present-day understandings onto the past. We can't assume that people back then thought the same way we do or were motivated by the same thing.
Yeah, we can't just assume that, a Roman emperor was basically just like a modern politician in a toga.
Right, exactly. And this idea that human nature itself is historically conditioned, it's had a huge impact on all sorts of fields, like, the social construction of identities, for example.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then another big theme in continental philosophy of history seems to be this question of directionality, which we touched on earlier. Does history have a purpose? Is it heading somewhere specific? We talked about this idea of teleology. And some philosophers, often those with religious beliefs, see history as unfolding according to God's plan. But then even some Enlightenment thinkers who are often rejecting traditional religion, they still held on to this idea of progress, this belief that humanity was on this, upward trajectory towards a better, more rational future.
Right, so this gets back to this deep human need to find meaning, to find some kind of pattern in the seemingly chaotic flow of events. Is there some rhyme or reason to all this? Are we moving towards something? These ideas of teleology, whether they're rooted in religion or in this more secular idea of progress, they've had a profound impact on how people have understood their place in the world, their place in time.
Right, like where are we going, basically?
Exactly. And this idea of looking for these big overarching patterns, it continued into the 20th century with these so-called meta-historians like Spengler and Toynbee. They were trying to identify these recurring cycles in the rise and fall of civilizations, looking for these grand historical laws.
Okay, and then we get to Hegel,
Yep.
who seems to be like the granddaddy of these grand narratives.
Yeah, he's a big one.
He had this whole incredibly complex system where he saw history as this process, but it wasn't just any process. He saw it as this this unfolding of reason, this progressive realization of human freedom. And he described these different stages, these historical stages from the ancient world up to, the modern nation state. And these stages were driven by these key world historical events. He saw these events as the turning points, the moments where the whole story kind of shifted in a new direction.
Yeah, Hegel's philosophy of history is definitely dense, but at its core is this idea that human consciousness, the spirit as he called it, is becoming more and more aware of itself, more and more free through this process of historical development. He basically thought that reason, this rational force, was working its way through history, even if people living through those events didn't always grasp the big picture. It's a powerful vision, but it's definitely been subject to, a lot of debate and criticism.
It sounds like it. Okay, so we've got these grand narratives. But then within continental philosophy, there's also this other approach called the hermeneutic approach. And this one seems to be less about these big sweeping stories and more about, really trying to understand the specific meanings and intentions of individuals in the past. It's like instead of looking for these universal laws, they're zooming in on the particularities of human experience.
Right. And it draws on ideas from literary interpretation, from the study of texts. It emphasizes that history is a lot like trying to understand a text. You're not just looking at the words on the page, you're trying to grasp what the author meant, what they were trying to convey. So this hermeneutic approach, it really focuses on this idea of understanding Verstehen, as a German philosopher Dilthey called it. He argued that, when you're studying humans, when you're studying history, you're dealing with something fundamentally different than the natural sciences. You're dealing with meaning, with intention, with purpose. So to really understand history, you need to try to reconstruct those meanings, those intentions, from the perspective of the people who live them.
Okay, so it's not just about observing what happened. It's about trying to understand what it meant to the people involved.
Exactly. And this approach has been really influential in fields like cultural history and intellectual history.
Okay. And then this hermeneutic tradition, it kind of took on a new urgency, a new intensity in the 20th century, especially after the World Wars and the Holocaust. The focus really shifting towards this idea of history as remembrance. Thinkers were wrestling with, how do we understand and represent these horrific events, these traumas, and how do we understand the relationship between individual memory, collective memory, and the formal historical accounts that we create?
Yeah, and this gets back to the ethical dimension, right? There was this growing sense that remembering and confronting these difficult pasts, these traumatic events, was a moral responsibility. You can see this in thinkers like Ricoeur and Lacapra. They explored how we go about representing these historical traumas and the role that memory plays, both individual and collective, in shaping our understanding of history and our sense of who we are. And of course, they were writing in the shadow of the Holocaust, which was this event that really forced people to confront the depths of human cruelty and the ways that societies can fail to remember or even choose to forget their own pasts.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. Okay, and then finally, within continental philosophy, our source mentions this thing called conceptual history, and it sounds like it's another way of slicing the cake. It's about looking at the concepts that we use to make sense of the past and how those concepts themselves have changed over time.
Yeah, and a key figure here is Reinhard Koselleck. He made this really insightful point, which is that if you want to understand a historical period, you really need to understand the concepts that people were using back then to understand their own world. Like, what did revolution mean in the 18th century? Was it the same thing as what it meant in the 20th century?
Right.
Koselleck, he looked at how these big concepts like revolution or modernity, how they emerged, how their meaning shifted, and how those conceptual shifts were both reflecting and shaping, social and political conflicts. It's a way of looking at the history of thought as this dynamic process that's intertwined with the history of events themselves. Ideas aren't just floating around out there. They're part of the fabric of history.
Okay, so it's like the tools we use to think about the past are themselves historical products, which is kind of a mind-bending thought.
It is. It is.
All right, so we've done a bit of a tour of continental philosophy of history. Let's hop across the Atlantic now and take a look at what's been happening in Anglo-American philosophy of history. And it sounds like the focus there has been a bit different, a bit less on these grand, sweeping narratives, and a bit more on the nuts and bolts of historical knowledge.
Yeah. Anglo-American philosophy of history has been heavily influenced by empiricism and, later on by analytic philosophy, which is really big on logic and clear thinking. So these thinkers have tended to be more focused on really carefully analyzing how historians do what they do and what makes for a good, solid historical explanation. They're a bit more skeptical, I guess you could say, of these grand speculative theories about the meaning of history. They're more interested in questions like, what makes a historical claim valid? Can historians ever really be objective? How do we analyze causation in history? Stuff like that.
Okay, so a bit more grounded, a bit more hands-on maybe.
I think you could say that, yeah.
All right, so one of the big debates in this Anglo-American tradition seems to have revolved around this idea of general laws in history. And the philosopher Carl Hempel, he made this pretty famous argument that all scientific explanations, including historical explanations, they have to be based on these general laws. It's like you can't really explain anything unless you can point to some underlying regularity, some pattern that holds true across different situations. And this sparked a lot of back and forth. A lot of historians and philosophers were like, no way, that's not how history works.
Yeah, it was a controversial claim.
Yeah.
And it gets back to this question of whether you can apply the methods of the natural sciences to the study of history. Like, are there laws of history in the same way that there are, laws of physics? A lot of critics of Hempel, they argue that history isn't about finding these universal rules of human behavior or social change. It's more about interpretation. It's about understanding the specific context. It's about tracing those unique chains of cause and effect that led to a particular outcome.
Okay, so instead of looking for the grand unified theory of everything, you're kind of embracing the messiness, the particularity of each historical situation.
Exactly.
And then another big issue in Anglo-American philosophy of history has been this question of objectivity. And this seems like a thorny one, right? Like, can historians ever truly be objective given that they have their own biases, their own background, their own values, and they can't possibly study everything, so they're always making choices about what to focus on, what to leave out. So is all history ultimately just a matter of perspective, just a matter of who's telling the story?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up in any field that deals with interpretation, right? And analytic philosophers, they've really dug into this, trying to understand what objectivity could even mean in the context of history. And they point out all sorts of challenges, like, the fact that a lot of human actions are based on values, on judgments about what's good or bad. And then there's the potential for bias, both conscious and unconscious, on the part of the historian. And then there's even this deeper philosophical question of whether there's even such a thing as a fixed historical reality that exists independently of how we think about it, independent of our representations of it.
Right, right. So it's like, even if we could somehow eliminate all our biases, which is probably impossible, we're still stuck with the fact that we're using language, we're using concepts, we're telling stories, and all of those things are shaped by, our culture, our worldview, all that stuff.
Exactly. So yeah, it's a challenge. But even with all these challenges, I think a lot of philosophers of history would say that striving for objectivity, being as rigorous as possible, being as transparent as possible about your methods, being really careful about your use of evidence, that's still a worthwhile goal. It's not that you can ever be perfectly objective, but you can at least try to be as fair and as accurate as possible.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And then, of course, there's this question of causation in history, which we've already touched on a bit. Like, what does it even mean to say that A caused B in the past? Do you need to find these underlying laws, these regularities, or is it enough to just look at the specific events and how they're connected?
Yeah, so this gets back to the debate about whether you can apply models from the natural sciences to history. Early on, a lot of analytic philosophers tried to fit historical causation into this mold, the idea that we infer causation from seeing the same sequence of events happen over and over again. But as the field developed, there was more of a recognition that historical causation is often way more complex than that. It involves human agency, it involves the reasons behind why people do what they do, and it often involves tracing these very specific chains of cause and effect that are unique to that particular situation.
Okay, so you're looking for the specific mechanisms that were at work in that particular case, not necessarily some universal law that applies to every case. Okay, and then it sounds like Anglo-American philosophy of history went through a bit of a shift in the 1970s, kind of like a loosening up, maybe. It was influenced by this thing called the linguistic turn and by ideas from hermeneutics, postmodernism, literary theory, all that stuff. And this new philosophy of history, it seems like it moved away from these scientific analogies and embraced the idea that history is a lot more about storytelling, about using language to create meaning, and that there's always an element of construction involved. Like, we're not just passively reflecting reality, we're actively shaping it through our narratives.
Exactly. And some of the key thinkers here are folks like Hayden White and Louis Mink. They really emphasize the role of narrative structure in historical writing. They argue that history isn't just a matter of listing facts. It's about crafting a story, using literary devices, creating a compelling and persuasive account. So it brought this whole dimension of interpretation, of subjectivity, even of rhetoric to the forefront.
Okay, so it's like even if we could somehow get all the facts right, which is already a challenge, there's still this whole other layer of how we choose to present those facts, how we weave them together into a story, and that shaping, that crafting, that's where things can get really interesting.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the action is, I think.
Okay. And this new approach, it also seems like it took on a more historically minded view of human nature itself. Like, instead of assuming that people are basically the same across time, it emphasized that the way we think, the way we experience the world, that's all shaped by our historical context.
Right, and this led to a lot more cross-pollination with other fields like literature and anthropology, because those fields were already thinking about how culture shapes human consciousness.
Mm.
It was about trying to understand the mentalities of people in the past, their worldviews, their assumptions, and this often meant trying to, immerse yourself in the sources to really try to see the world through their eyes.
Okay, so it's like you're not just trying to explain what that did, you're trying to understand how they saw the world, what their reality was like.
Exactly.
And then finally, within recent Anglo-American philosophy of history, there seems to be this growing interest in the question of historical ontology, which we touched on earlier. It's that question of what are the real things that we're talking about when we talk about history? Do these big concepts like revolution or market society, do they actually exist as entities in the world? Or are they just these convenient labels that we use to group together a bunch of individual events and actions?
Yeah, and this gets back to the very foundation of how we make sense of the past. Are these big abstract concepts, are they real things with their own causal power? Like, do revolutions happen or do people make revolutions happen?
Right, right. And it seems like the answer to that question could really shape how you go about doing history.
It totally does.
Okay, so we've looked at some of the big debates and approaches within both continental and Anglo-American philosophy of history, and now our source, kinda.